Good afternoon. My name is Dale Fleury, and this is a edited, abbreviated lesson that I utilize with my online students in AP United States American History. One of the things that, of course, that students who take AP US History have to be prepared to do is to write, excuse me, write successfully on the national exam. They have to present a thesis statement to complete a document-based question, and they also have to respond to several long essay questions. This is a lesson that I use in the skill building portion of my course to get them to understand how to use all the people, places, dates, events, and themes, and so on, so that they can properly put together an effective essay or document-based question. So I'll be presenting this to you in an abbreviated fashion, and I hope you find it useful. So today, class, what we're going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to take a look at a very, very important technique known as ESP. You have all received earlier a template that contained the letters E, S, and P, and they all stood for economic, social, and political. And now we're going to take a look at them again, and we are going to practice applying our ESP and understand why it's so valuable and important in preparation for the United States History National Examination. So I'll be sharing my screen with you right now. And we will begin. So as you see here, this is ESP and success on the national exam. And these are three proven techniques that utilize ESP that will be very, very helpful for you in your preparation. One of the things that students always are concerned about, particularly in a course like AP US History, because it is a survey course, it moves very fast, and there's lots of information and content that students have to master and recall. So one of the things is how do you do that? How do I remember all of that information? And one of the things I just want you to realize from the outset is something about how the human brain functions. Where do we put all this information? Memorization is one of the things that students often resort to when preparing for exams. But for an exam like this type, memorization is not going to be very helpful. What you're going to have to be able to do is recall and store information into your long-term memory bank. This is a process that your brain can do, but it's something that you must practice, just like an exercise or a technique. You have to practice it and practice it. And one of the things that our brain does, according to research, is that it categorizes information. So if you can take a term, an event, a concept, and put it into a category, it is a lot easier to recall, and it is a lot easier to remember. So one of the things that we're going to do is use this technique of retrieval and recall known as ESP. And so we're going to look at what that storage process is going to look like and how then we retrieve that information once we store it in our brain. And once you do this and practice this, you'll find that it's much easier to recall this information. So here is the template that we handed out and you were given several days ago. And this is what ESP stands for. Obviously, it's not extrasensory perception, but it does stand for something very, very important in any social studies class. And that is categorizing information by its economic importance, its social importance, and its political importance. So as you can see here, what I've done for you is I've provided you a laundry list, if you will, of what it means by economic, what is meant by social, what is meant by political. So when you think about and study American history, don't study it just in a vacuum. Take a look at the people, places, things, events, and terms in terms of how would I categorize this? Why is this important? Of what significance is a particular term, concept, date, person, place, or event? And this list, although it's not all encompassing, it is pretty thorough. And this enables you then to be able to store that information and then to retrieve it. And we're going to practice this a little bit with some of the units that we covered earlier. And then we're going to go into our breakout rooms where you'll be able to practice this with your colleagues. And then we'll come back together and discuss. All right, so first thing, though, let's take a look at the economic category. Now, as you go through the economic category, is there anything on this list that you're not aware of, or you would like explained, or would like defined? And if you do, please raise your hand, and I'll see it on the screen, and I'll be able to respond. All right, moving on to category 2. Obviously, during the lesson, I would be responding to a lot of responses on some of these. I'll give you an example as we go into the next category. So moving on to category 2, S stands for social. And I see we have a question from Rita, and Rita is asking, I'm not quite sure what norms are. Could you explain that? And I'll do that. Norms are kind of acceptable rules of behavior or ways of acting in society. And it's very, very closely related to the term underneath, unwritten rules of behavior. They're almost used interchangeably, but norms, a good example of a norm would be how parents raise their children in terms of child rearing and disciplining and providing them with the necessities that they need for life. There are no written rules established as to how to do that, but there are just certain ways of behaving in a society, and we call those norms. Okay, and the last category is political. So in political, obviously, it's a lot of government-related items, and it's also related to interactions with other countries. So collectively, this is your ESP. So whenever you come across a term or an event or a person or a place, you should be able to remember it by putting it into one or several of these categories. Because one of the things that you need to understand is that a particular event, for example, a war, obviously it's political and there are political consequences, but there were social consequences of a war and there are economic consequences of a war as well. A particular law that goes into effect is going to have economic consequences, social consequences, and political consequences. So let's take a few, look at a few examples from one of the earlier units that we studied, and that was during the constitutional period and the founding of our country. And I'll leave the template up, but down below, you will see the term and the item. And these are from assignments that you did earlier. And so these are actual student responses filling in economic, social, and political. So here's an event from the colonial period, the Boston Tea Party. And of course, not only knowing what the Boston Tea Party was, it's important to understand what economic, social, and political significance it has. And again, by remembering that, you can think about how to recall that event and put it into context, which we'll take a look at a little bit later in our lesson today. So the Boston Tea Party, one of the students said it was an attempt by the colonists to raise awareness of unfair taxing policies on commonly used products. So if we look up here, is this correct, economic? And if you take a look at the chart, we're talking about imports, we're talking about taxes, and we're talking about production and consumption. So absolutely, this fits that economic category. Okay. Socially, a student responded by saying this was colonists who formed an organization known as the Sons of Liberty to protest. And again, the Boston Tea Party definitely was by the Sons of Liberty. They were the ones who organized it. But if you take a look at social and you take a look at social movements and protests, interaction with the environment, they did dump a bunch of tea into the harbor. Okay. And then finally, political. And the student responded by saying this was a good example of colonists' view regarding the political concept of taxation without representation. So this has to deal with government structure, government processes, government programs, and policies. Next item, let's take a look at a person or people. And the item here that was given was Federalist. And so a student response economic was that the Federalists were primarily made up of merchants and businessmen who favored tariffs and a Bank of the United States. It's a great answer. It fits the economic category. Social, the Federalists were better educated and more literate than the rest of early American society, and they lived primarily in New England and coastal regions. And so you can see here that this fits demographics, it fits education, it fits social patterns of behavior. Okay. And finally, the political category of Federalists was that the Federalists supported strong national government to prevent problems caused by the Articles of Confederation. All right, so notice again, one particular item can be recalled and can have economic, social, and or political significance or consequences. So as you go through your review for the national exam, this is one way to kind of remember and restore and recall all of the events and information that you studied throughout the year. Last item here is the middle passage. So here is a concept, a thing. And economically, the middle passage was the main point of the triangle trade during the 17th century. And this was how slaves were brought or transported to the colonies and eventually replaced the indentured servitude system that had been earlier established in the English colonies in Virginia and the Southern colonies. The social significance led to the establishment of slavery as an acceptable institution, way of life in America, and obviously led to sectionalism and ultimately to the struggle known as the Civil War. And finally, politically, it would lead to sectionalism and anti-slavery movements and government policies and processes with regard to the regulation or expansion of that institution. So that's one way that ESP can be used. Another way is thinking about it in terms of how to respond to writing prompts that appear on the national exam. So here you see an example of a document-based question, an example of a short answer question, and an example of a long essay question that had appeared in previous national exams, which ESP can be very, very helpful for you to resort to. For example, the first question says, evaluate the impact of Reconstruction on African American society from 1865 to 1900. So I've highlighted for you the term impact. What impact on African American society? Well, Reconstruction, obviously we know, and you'll be able to recall certain events and so on, but what were the economic, social, and political events of Reconstruction? And by doing that, you can identify, okay, what economically impacted African American society during the period known as Reconstruction? What socially impacted them? And what politically impacted them? Here's a short answer question. Describe one similarity between the New Deal and Great Society programs. Of course, the New Deal in the 1930s, the Great Society of the LBJ presidency in the 1960s. What kind of similarity? Was it similar economically, similar socially, similar politically? A good example of that would be politically, there were government programs that were introduced to help the underrepresented and underserved. So that would be a political similarity between the New Deal and Great Society programs, and you'd be given credit for that on the national exam. And finally, evaluate the extent to which new technology fostered change. And again, what fostered change? What kind of change in the United States from 1865 to 1900, which was a long essay question? Economically, socially, and politically. And so you think about, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad. What kind of economic change did that bring about? What kind of social change did that bring about? What kind of political change did that bring about? So just understanding the technology is not enough. You're going to have to be able to explain what kind of change, what was changing, what resulted from that. And again, using ESP will be very, very helpful in that regard. And finally, besides retention, recall, and writing, here's another reason why ESP is so important. And this is probably the most significant thing with regard to your preparation for the national exam. You get extra points on the national exam for doing something that is called contextualizing. Contextualization, students, is the ability to make connections, large connections between a particular event. And by doing that, you're going to increase your opportunity to receive a higher score on the exam, because this allows the reader to understand that you really know why an important event is significant, what it led to, why other things happened as a result of that. So utilizing ESP enables you to contextualize, and that's a great asset to have on the national exam. Here's another way of thinking about contextualization. So in the middle, you have the event, and you think about it. If you take, take the Federalists, for example, and we talked about the economic significance, social significance, and political significance. But now if you see how you can make those connections, now you understand how to contextualize. Contextualizing is taking, for example, the Federalists. As a result of the Federalists, what did they do? What was the cause and effect of Federalist action? Why are the Federalists so important? Why, what is the so what? Why did the Federalists do what they did? When did the Federalists do what they did? Where was the Federalist stronghold in the American colonies during the constitutional period? And how did the Federalists go about convincing the anti-federalists and others to ratify the United States Constitution. So we'll be referring to this chart much more later in our, as we begin to prepare more and more for the writing on the national exam. So what I'd like you to do now is, you've all been assigned to a breakout room, and we're going to take a look at utilizing ESP and begin our contextualization of the home front during World War II. So here you have each group in your breakout room will be given a number of items, and it's very, very similar to what we just went through earlier. And among yourselves, what you want to do is to be able to identify what the item is, and then explain its economic, its social, and its political significance. Are there any questions on that task? So having heard done, I'm going to allow you to go into your breakout rooms. Each group has received 4 items, and I'll give you 15 minutes to respond, and then we'll come back together and we'll review your responses. Go ahead.